Hi, it's Eleanor, and today I thought I'd share with you all the books that I read in August. I managed to read 4 books, which is no hay amount. I've never really counted how many books I've read each month, so I can't really compare it to anything, but I'm pretty happy with it. I read a weird collection of books this month. I read a fiction, a classic, a non-fiction, a collection of poetry, and a play. Let's get into it. So the first book that I read this month was a classic, and it was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is my first Virginia Woolf that I've read, so it was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. So you follow the main character, Mrs. Dalloway, as she goes about through her day, kind of preparing for this party, and it's set in kind of mid-1920s London. And as she's going around throughout her day, she's kind of meeting old friends and flashbacks to the past and everything, so it was really fleshed out. And you also have another character called Septimus, and he was a soldier in the First World War, and he's suffering from PTSD, so you also get his story at the same time. What was really interesting is that it was how Virginia Woolf used time. So every now and then you'd hear, or they'd mention that the Big Ben's chiming 3 or whatever, and you know, it was like you're counting down and building up to the party, which was ultimately going to be the climax of the story. So Virginia Woolf's writing style is very unique. It's a stream of consciousness, which means it's basically you hear the characters, you basically hear what they're thinking, and it's like you're inside their head, which is you get very personal with the characters, which is really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. It's quite difficult to get into it to start off with, because it's, you know, if it's something you haven't read anything like this before, it's very unusual. And for some of the sentences I did have to kind of read them out loud a couple of times to really understand them, because it's like lots of semicolons and everything. What I really liked about the book was how she changed from the different narratives, if that makes sense. So for example, at one point you'd follow Clarissa Dalloway, and then she'd be walking through and she'd hear someone argue, a couple argue, and then you'd stop her narrative and then you'd pick up with the arguing couple, and it turns out that they're someone you're following, and you kind of hear both sides, and it's very smooth. And this kind of really made me think of the word Sonder, where everyone else is living a life and has their own story, but you don't know anything about it. And it really made me think, because if they're walking along and they hear this couple arguing, you know, they just was like, oh, it's probably a lover's tiff, but we find out in a minute that it's something a lot more serious. Also, because this was only written in the mid-20s or something, it was really incredible how well she portrayed Septimus, considering that, you know, PTSD wasn't really talked about, they didn't really know much about, and her perception and portrayal of it was very clever. Also, with Clarissa and Septimus, the two characters were really interesting as kind of parallels. So they never actually meet in the book, but Clarissa only kind of hears of him kind of at the end of the book, and she feels a connection with him despite not meeting him. And I thought that was really interesting, because they seem to be two completely different characters. You know, he fought in the war, she's an upper middle class, you know, woman who throws parties, although she's more to that than that. But I thought it was really interesting how she viewed him and how she felt they were similar. So overall, I really enjoyed Mrs. Dalloway, and I think I'm going to pick up another Woolf hopefully sometime in the future. The next book I read was a non-fiction book, and I mentioned it in my Classics TBR, and this was A Brief Guide to Classical Civilization by Stephen Kershaw. This was an interesting book, to say the least. I still don't know how I feel about it, because I liked it in some parts, but I didn't like it in others. And I think ultimately it's very difficult to write about the whole of classical civilization of ancient Roman Greece in one book because when you read a book about a specific subject, they go really in depth, and you know that this is what they really like and what they're really interested in. They've done a lot of research to it, whereas because this covers everything, you don't really feel his passion as much, which I think is important with a non-fiction book. With a lot of the things, so for example, when he talked about Homer, he just kind of described the plot with little analysis, and some of the analysis he did was wrong in my opinion. when he talked about architecture and art, when he was describing, I don't know, the vases or whatever, but I personally knew what they looked like and so could imagine them. But if you're a beginner who just wants to learn about kind of generally, you would have no idea what they look like, and you wouldn't, well, I personally wouldn't go and Google it. It's, you know, too much effort for me. And it's just, I feel like there should have been pictures. But on the other hand, it did basically threw up a lot of questions and things that I personally could discover more about, and kind of it helped me question his book and learn to question other non-fiction books, if that makes sense. So I think I gave it 2 out of 5. I just don't know how I feel about it. I made lots of annotations, which I guess is good, but then a lot of my annotations were like, really? Is this actually right? Because some of the stuff, especially he said about Homer, actually contradicts what my teacher said. Between the two of them, I'm going to go with my teacher more. So yeah, don't know what to think of this one. So the next book that I read was a collection of poetry, and it was The World's Wife by Carol Ann Duffy, which I mentioned in my August haul. This is the second poetry collection I've read by her. I read The Bees, which I also enjoyed. It's been a while since I've read poetry, so I think it was good to choose. I think this is a good book to get back into poetry with. I really, really enjoyed it. I don't know if you can see, but I post-it noted few of my favourite ones. I thought it was so clever what she did. So basically what it is she took historical and mythological figures and told their story from the perspective of their wife or their sister or female mythological stories. And it was kind of putting, not necessarily like putting women in where they shouldn't be, but just giving them another perspective, because often in history women have been completely ignored and you only get men's point of views. So this was really, really interesting to look at it. I also really, really enjoyed how she kind of constructed the poems and the techniques that she used. So basically with them I had to read them out loud, because I feel like that's the best way to get poetry, is to read it out loud. And she does a lot of internal rhyme, a lot of half rhymes, and they just sound really, really lovely. And she's so clever in the way that, in her rhymes and the way that she does it, and it really inspired me to write more poetry, and to write poetry which is meant to be read aloud, and which is meant to have rhymes and internal rhymes and half rhymes, and, you know, not quite there, but it's meant to rhyme, but So one of my favourite lines is from Mrs. Midas, one of the poems in here, and it goes, "Look, we all have wishes granted, but who has wishes granted?" And I just love that line, because you have the play on word of the granted and the granted, and it's so clever, and I really, really love it, and that's one of my favourite poems. And another one I have, one of my favourite poems is Little Red Cap, which is basically obviously about Little Red Riding Hood, and it's kind of, but also it's about a young girl who's learning to be a poet from the wolf, and that really resonates with me, because I'm trying to write my own poetry, and it was really powerful to me. There's also a lot of humour within the book, within the poems. So a couple of them are quite short and very, very funny. So for example, Mrs. Darwin, 7th of April 1852. Went to the zoo. I said to him, "Something about that chimpanzee over there reminds me of you." They're just very short, well, something like that. Her humour is very short and to the point, and just makes you laugh out loud when you first read it. The majority of them are dramatic monologues, which means you really, really get into the characters, and the poems are very personal, I find. There were a few poems which I didn't like as much, maybe because I didn't necessarily know the original story that well, so a couple of them I had to look up. So maybe that, because I didn't know it intuitively, I couldn't quite work with it. But I think that's just personally for me. So overall, I really, really, really love this collection of poems. I gave it a 4 out of 5, just knocked the 1 star off because of the few that I didn't quite get. But again, that's just personally for me. And I would definitely recommend it to anyone who wants to read kind of feminist poetry and really, really enjoys like mystery, mythology, gosh, what am I doing? And like history, because there's also some like biblical stories as well. So it was really good. The last book I read was a play, and it was Oscar Wilde's An Ideal Husband. and this basically follows Sir Robert and his wife, Lady Chiltern, and he, you know, he's in politics and he's very much on top of his game, and she idealizes him, but then it turns out he didn't get his money in a legitimate way, and he ends up being blackmailed in order to promote something which he doesn't agree with, and it kind of all goes on from that. And I adore Wilde. I think he is very, very clever, and I was on the edge of my seat when I was reading this, because you, as the audience, you know everything that's happening. Because there's this whole bit where there's massive miscommunication about, they thought that this person was another person, you know, like a lot of Oscar Wilde plays, I think. But then you knew exactly what it was, and the dramatic irony just makes it so much better, and it was really, really something I can engage with. One of the reasons I love Oscar Wilde is because he was one of the kind of pioneers of the aesthetic movement, which is basically when they were like, art for art's sake, you know, the purpose of art is to be art, and it's to be aesthetically pleasing and everything. And I think that really comes across in this play, because Lord Goring, who's one of my favourite characters, he's this kind of 30-something, lazy, layabout, upper class. They're all upper class. That's kind of who he writes about. He's seen as this really lazy bachelor who's really stupid, but then he actually comes up with these really intelligent kind of quips that a lot of the time they're like, do you know what you're talking about? And he's like, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. If I think really hard about it, I do. And it's just about how you don't expect him to be that clever, but when you look into his character a lot more, he really, really is, and some of his quotes are my favourite things. And it really reflects kind of Wilde and the aesthetic movement, I feel. So that was the 4 books that I read in August. I hope to read more in September, but I'm not entirely sure, because obviously I have school starting and I have lots to do then, but hopefully I can read maybe about the same, bit more, who knows. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.